Hello everyone, this is me, Debosmita Sarkar. Today we are going to start with Cbse Class 8 English, the open window. So let's begin. The Open Window, Part 1. Frampton Nuttall has bad nerves. He retires to the country for cure and calls on a family friend. The lady, being busy upstairs, her young niece refers to a family mishap with focus on the open window. My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall, said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. Here self-possessed means calm and confident. In the meantime, you must try and put up with me. Frampton Nuttall endeavoured to say something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Here Frampton Nuttall was tried to say something, he was uh, but he doubted that he could make the niece happy. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits of a succession of total strangers would do much toward helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. So, Frampton Nuttall has bad nerves. He came to this house for a cure. I know how it will be, his sisters had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. You will bury yourself down then and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from mopping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice. So, the sister of Frampton Nuttall told Frampton told him that if he doesn't talk to anyone, then his nerve will be worse than ever. So, for his help, his sister gave some letters of introduction to whom she knew, and she also told that as far as she could remember, they were quite nice. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. So here Frampton doubted that whether Mrs. Sappleton would come to the nice division which his sister mentioned. Do you know many of the people round there? Asked her niece, when she judged that they had held sufficient silent communion. Hardly a soul, said Frampton. My sister was staying here some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. Then you know nothing. You know practically nothing about my aunt? Pursued the self-possessed young lady. Only her name and address, admitted the caller. Here caller means Frampton Nuttall. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state, and undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. So here Mr. Stapleton wondered that whether Mr. Nuttall wondered whether Mrs. Stapleton was married or widowed, because he could, because the room where he was seemed to suggest masculine habitation. Now the niece said, her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago, said the child. That would be since her sister's time? Her tragedy? Asked Frampton. Somehow in this restful country, spot tragedy seemed out of place. You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon, said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. It is quite warm for the time, said Frampton, but has that window got anything to do with the tragedy? out through that window 3 years ago to a day her husband and her two young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite shooting ground, they were all three engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, and places that were safe in other years gave away suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. So, here moor means grassland and treacherous means dangerous. Bog means wet, spongy ground, and falteringly means in a shaky voice. Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly. Falteringly means shaky voice. Falteringly human. Poor auntie always think about that they will come back someday. They and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them and they walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is opened and is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt! She has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, "Bertie, why do you bound?" as he always did to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window. So it's quite scary, I think. Now we come to part 2 of this story. The short summary of the part 2 is Mrs. Appleton comes down at last and inadvertently confirms her new story. Frampton tries to acquaint his host with the nature of his ailment. Through the open window he can see things that worsen his nerves. Now comes to the story. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a vial of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. So now we got to know that the self-possessed young lady of 15 is Vera. The name of the self-possessed young lady of 15 is Vera. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Appleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they will always come in this way. They have been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they will make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you menfolk, isn't it?" So telling this, the aunt confirms the niece, Miss Vera's story. She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk to a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly staring past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. So here, Frampton told whatever Mrs. Appleton was telling. Frampton thought all this purely horrible. He was sad for the hostess, for Mrs. Appleton. He wanted to change the topic and change the topic to a less ghastly topic, means a boring topic. He was conscious. He knew that the hostess was her not giving him any attention, and her eyes were constantly on that open window. And Mr. Nuttall paid his visit on the anniversary of this event, of this tragedy, tragic anniversary. The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest and absence of mental excitement and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise, announced Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailment and infirmities. Their cause and cure on the matter of diet they are not so much in agreement, he continued. No, said Mrs. Sapple in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into the alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. Here they are at last, she cried. Just in time for tea, and don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes? Frampton shivered slightly and turned toward the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with a dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. The deepening twilight, three figures were walking across the lawn toward the window. They all carried guns under their arms. One of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulder. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk. I say, Bertie, why do you bound? So, the scary part begins from here. Frampton could see. According to Frampton, he could see the three figures, and the figures were all those were, according to Vera's story, were killed. They died in a treacherous piece of bog. Oh my God. Now we come to part 3. What else can Frampton do by beat a hasty retreat? Had he seen a ghost? The nice does have a knack for explaining an uncanny coincidence. Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and had the hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. Here Frampton grabbed grabbed the stick and hat and just went out of the hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate after seeing those three figures in the twilight. A cyclist was coming along the road, and the cyclist had to run to the hedge to avoid imminent collision. Here we are, my dear, said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. Who was that who bolted out as we came up? A most extraordinary man, a Mr. Nuttall, said Mrs. Appleton. He could only talk about his illness, and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost. Exactly, he had seen a ghost. I expect it was his spaniel, said the niece calmly. He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into the cemetery somewhere on the banks of Ganges by a pack of dogs, and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him, enough to make anyone lose their nerve. So here the niece replied that Mrs. Nuttall went because of the brown spaniel. She told that Mr. Nuttall had a horror of dog, and told a story that he was once hunted in a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creature snarling and grinning and foaming just above him enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Actually, whereas Whereas specialty was romance at short notice. He liked to make stories, and he can make and she makes an influential story that anyone could believe. So here, this story is the open window is written by Saki H. Munro. Hector Fu Munro. So let's go to the summary part. So now we'll talk about the summary. The Open Window was written by Hector Munro, who was better known by the pen name Saki. The story begins with Frampton Nuttall, who visits the countryside for treatment for his nerves. He didn't know anybody in that place. Also, his sister gave him some letters of introduction, hoping this would help him to get acquainted with the very few people there. Once he reaches the country, he visits Mrs. Stapleton, where he meets her 15-year-old niece named Vera. She is a confident and calm looking girl who assures Mr. Nuttall that her aunt would be coming downstairs soon. Meanwhile, Vera inquires with him if he knows any people around that place. He mentions that his sister visited that place 4 years ago and gave him some letters of introduction. On that account, he has come to visit Mrs. Appleton. As Mr. Nuttall looks around the room, he realizes that the house is also inhabited by men. However, he hesitates and wonders whether Mrs. Appleton is a married or a widow. While he is lost in thoughts, Vera suddenly mentions that about 3 years ago her aunt's husband and a two young brother went out for shooting but never returned. She points towards the large French window that opens on a lawn. Further, she tells Mr. Nuttall that the men never came back as they were trapped in the swampy land and their bodies could not be recovered till death. Vera further says that her aunt, Mrs. Appleton, always keeps this particular window open until it gets dark, hoping that her husband and her brother would return someday. Sometimes even Vera feels that her uncles would come through the open window along with the dog in the same manner. Meanwhile, Mrs. Appleton arrives and apologizes for being late. She also mentions her husband and brothers who have gone out shooting for birds. Besides, she tells Mr. Nuttall that she keeps the window wide open for them to enter into the house so that they do not ruin the carpet with their mud-coated shoes. However, Mr. Nuttall feels a spooky air in the room and he tries to change the topic of discussion, but Mrs. Appleton continues talking about the shooting and scarcity of bad birds in that area. Soon, Frampton realizes that she is looking towards the window while talking to him and not paying attention to him. Suddenly, she tells him that the men have returned from the shooting and were just on time for tea. This frightens Mr. Nuttall even more and he shivers with fear. He turns to look towards Vera for sympathy. But even the young girl was looking through the window with a dazed horror in her eyes. Mr. Nuttall started feeling uncomfortable and suddenly notices three figures carrying guns under their arms and walking across the lawn towards the open window. A tired brown spaniel is also coming along with them. Frightened, Mr. Nuttall quickly grabs his stick and hat and rushes out of the house. Finally, Mrs. Appleton's husband walks into the room, but he is surprised why Mr. Nuttall hasn't out of the room without meeting him. Mrs. Appleton tells her husband that he is ill and rushed out of the house even without bidding a goodbye to anyone. The way he exits the room appears that he has seen some ghost. To this, Vera states that probably Mr. Nuttall is afraid of dogs. She mentions how he was once attacked by dogs in a cemetery and he was so nervous that he had to spend a night in a newly dug grave with the dogs growling around him. So the conclusion of this story is the chapter The Open Window illustrates that we should not believe other people's word blindly who often try to manipulate or convince us to believe them. Besides, the lesson also teaches students that we should not deceive or manipulate others' mind by creating fake stories or rumors unnecessarily. So with this we came to the end. Thank you. Please do like, share and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to comment in the comment section below. Bye bye. Stay home and stay safe.